Afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to have with us Professor Juan Campo. Professor Campo is with us as a visiting professor at MEI. And on regular days, he's Associate Professor of Religious Studies at UC Santa Barbara and Director of the UCSB Education Abroad Program. So perhaps he'll send us good students from California. We have been, okay. Good thing about Professor Campo, he does comparative studies of Islam in the Middle East and South Asia. And this is something we're interested in MEI, to see a broader Middle East with more wings, more legs, however you want to put it. And he works on sacred space, pilgrimage, popular religious practices, and political Islam. He's recently put out the Encyclopedia of Islam, one-volume reference work, which received the Best of Reference Award from the New York Public Library in 2010. I think giving the Brill people very good competition. Probably more accessible, and easier to heft. He has also authored The Other Sides of Paradise, Explorations of the Religious Meanings of Domestic Space in Islam, which won the AAR, American Academy of Religions Award for Excellence in 1991. And he's published articles on Hajj, death and afterlife, belief practices in Islam, culinary cultures, and issues in contemporary Islam in edited volumes and reference works, including, of course, in the Brill's Encyclopedia of the Quran and Islam. He's currently writing a book about modern Muslim, Hindu, and Christian mass pilgrimages in comparative perspective. I think it's an exciting project for me, because pilgrimages, of course, are present across all these different religious traditions, and they are, if you think of pilgrimage in terms of Islam, in India, they are massive. I think massive is the word, massive. And of course, some of the pilgrimage-oriented people in Islam, like Ibn al-Arabi, of course, grew up in Andalusia, Christian Andalusia, which some people think was the origin of his interest in these things. So I think there are a lot of interconnections, and I'm sure Professor Campo is going to tell us about them, as well as about, I think, something new and interesting, which is the environmental impact of the pilgrimages, which ties together very nicely interest in Islam here, interconnected Islam, as well as the new urgent matter of the environment. So please welcome Professor Campo.
Are you able to pick this up? Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to present some of my work to you this afternoon. I've been truly honored to have been invited to come here for this semester. I found it very rewarding in academic ways, but also personally rewarding. I've enjoyed getting to know Singapore and learning more about its history and its place in the sort of global scene, and then having an opportunity to really just spend all my time writing and not having to grade papers and advise as much. I still do some advising for students, but fortunately it's been minimal a little bit. And I want to particularly thank Professor Ensing Ho and then Peter Sluglet for helping to make this possible for me and the Middle East Institute as a whole. The context, as Ensing indicated, for my talk today is part of a larger project on the comparative study of mass pilgrimage under the conditions of modernity. And many pilgrimages become kind of a pedestrian term in many ways. Sometimes it's talked about as kind of a spiritual journey that an individual makes. Sometimes it's talked about in terms of formal rituals, that the pilgrims do certain things in certain ways in a certain sequence and things like that. So it's a ritual process. Pilgrimage is a sort of literary theme. So there have been lots of ways in which to define it. There are very simple ways of defining it as sort of a religious journey to a sacred place. But I found that what really works for me is to really think about it in more complex ways, and so sort of begin with a kind of Durkheimian notion that for me pilgrimage is a total social fact, a form of mobility that involves the social, the political, the economic, yes, the religious, and the ecological components of human experience and thought and social organization. So there are key components to this project that I've been involved in. I look at it as a sort of triangular mode of comparison. So I'm looking at, what I call mass pilgrimages in the modern context. So these are pilgrimage traditions that involve millions of people. So it's on that scale. It's a way of sort of focusing my topics. As so many pilgrimages as a phenomenon can cover so many different facets of mobility. So this concept of mass is very important for me, and so looking at it in 3 different geographic contexts, with relationship to 3 different religious traditions that have pre-modern traditions of pilgrimage, that go back centuries, and sort of understand what has happened to these more medieval or even more ancient pilgrimage traditions as they move into the context of modernity. So yes, the development of global-based cultural movements and exchanges in the modern period that become more intensified as a result of new kinds of technology is part of that, but also the idea of interconnectivities on a global level. So yes, there are 3 different kinds of pilgrimage contexts that I'm looking at, but I understand that to a certain degree there's a way of thinking about them in a global framework, and we have to think about them in a global framework if we're going to be talking about modernity. And this is something I've really been wrestling with as I move through my project, as how to demonstrate this, but still be very much aware of the local formations, the local factors, the contextual factors in the locality. So this kind of dynamic relations or synergy between the local and global as they're manifested through these pilgrimages. And so the 3 pilgrimages I've chosen, one coming out of my own long-term familiarity with Islam is obviously the hajj. But I became dissatisfied with the way in which hajj was talked about because it was dealt with as a kind of isolated subject, either in the pre-modern period in medieval Islam, according to religious traditions of what the hajj is, or even in the modern period, modern studies of the hajj. David Long and Robert Bianchi being examples, focused only on the hajj. And the Saudi discourses about the hajj, literature in Arabic is only focused on the hajj. There's no real effort to think about the hajj in relationship to other modern mass pilgrimages and how is it similar and how is it different from these others. And so one of the things that got me thinking about it is, having gone for a conference to Mexico City back in the 90s and visiting the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is located on the northern edge of Mexico City. The guide that we had taking us out there was talking about Guadalupe is the Mecca of Catholics in Mexico. So you have, this kind of way of making comparisons, even sort of on the sort of mundane, everyday level of discourses. As a result of my, responsibilities as a director of the University of California program in Delhi, India, I had an opportunity to become familiar with a mass pilgrimage in South India to the Sabarimala, which is one of the subjects I'll be focusing on this afternoon, and actually participated in that pilgrimage. And when I was up at the mountaintop temple, the Muslim caretaker for the Muslim shrine it's basically a Hindu temple, was comparing Sabarimala to the Hajj in a very favorable way. So here I'm in Mexico City, there's a comparison with the Hajj, and talking with a Muslim attendant at a shrine for a Muslim saint up at the temple site in the mountain of Sabarimala, again making that kind of comparison. And so I thought that there might be some interesting ways in pursuing this subject more than just sort of the pedantic, sort of superficial kind of comparative level, and try to really unpack and kind of comparative approach to looking at these 3 pilgrimages and tell us not only how these specific pilgrimages have changed over time, but also how they've been involved in being structured by modernity, but also how they involved in structuring modernities in certain contexts and certain important ways, even on a global scale. So my ways, the book that I have in mind is, going to have a section on sacred narratives and how they're reconstituted in a modern framework, embodied ritual practices and how they become re-articulated in the modern context, pilgrimage in the modern state, visualizations of pilgrimage through the modern media, and then the question of mortality and the meanings of modern pilgrimage. So aspects of each of these chapters, shall we say, in my book project will be surfacing, I think, in my talk this afternoon. iconography of religious traditions. Then the second part will deal with the ecological impacts of mass pilgrimage, going to two pilgrimage sites. And the third part will be ways in which governments and human organizations, social action networks, NGOs that are intended to address the ecological impacts. So those are the only afternoon. So to the 18th century on tile representation of the Meccan holy site, sacred space. And so each feature in this tile has a label, in Arabic telling you what it is. So obviously there's an intent to let the viewers understand something about the sacred geography of Mecca and the Kaaba, obviously in the center here. But notice that it's not only depicting the grand mosque that others do there, but it's also depicting the landscape around it, kind of situated in that landscape, and actually there being a memorial to holy places up on the surrounding mountains. So again, kind of an effort to portray that sacred landscape before there's photography. There's even representations of Mecca and pilgrimage sites going back to, I think, the 12th and 13th century when we had pilgrimage certificates that were produced in Mecca for pilgrims to take home with proof that they did on the places. So we have some depictions and visual forms of sacred landscape. So this one reflects kind of European interest in terms of perspective of the community. And then the photography is introduced. The first photograph of Mecca was done by Sabarimala, an engineer who accompanied the consistent pilgrimage caravan. So, photograph. Well, again, he's photographing the sacred landscape and reproducing it through, the photography as it existed at that time for other people to view. Obviously, he was funded by the Egyptian state at the time, but then those photographs began to gain circulation, so he even won awards in Europe for his depiction of the sacred sites. So again, focus on the Kaaba, here, very prominent. The scale, the Kaaba really stands out in the photograph. The surrounding galleries are made to look smaller. The only thing that's, sort of dominating the scene more than the Kaaba in the background is the minaret and then the houses, but those houses are on a hill. So, those are, again, reflecting the sort of local landscape, but clearly the Kaaba is in the center in this depiction. Later on, there were, with photography, we begin to have the commercial productions of pictures of Mecca. On the left is done by an Indian photographic agency that created postcards for the Hajj. So pilgrims would purchase these in Mecca and take them back home. And oftentimes they created, the postcards would have Urdu poetry on it. It'd talk about the sacredness of not just the Kaaba, but all the various holy sites in Mecca, kind of articulating them in poetic form. So again, it's sort of representation to the faithful, trying to bring people together, sort of giving them kind of a pan-Islamic understanding of the, the Hajj and also the sacredness of this space. Because remember, when we think about Muslims in South Asia, even at this time, many of them probably had no way of visualizing what the Kaaba or Mecca was. We just had to go by the sacred texts and whatever the ulama or the preacher would say about it from the tradition of the hadith and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, etc. It's something that they had to kind of imagine from text. But now there are these photographic visualizations that are provided and circulated widely, not only in South Asia, but they become part of a global kind of circulation of these images. And then you have early 20th century depiction when you begin to have religious posters produced in India over there on the right, very much emulating the photographic. So you hear the sort of the artwork, the print emulates the imagery of the photograph and the perspectives and things like that. But notice that the poster lacks people. It's an empty space, emphasizing the divine perhaps aspects of the site, and maybe even calling the viewer in to imagine themselves filling that space by going there on a pilgrimage. So I think these visual representations kind of begin to draw people in to think about themselves actually making the journey there from parts of the world that are outside of the Middle Eastern context. More posters here. This relates to the Kaaba and its landscape. You can still see hills in the background there with buildings on them. So the mountain component, the fact that Mecca is in a kind of valley remains here. But then it shows the Kaaba idealized at the center of other holy places. And again, you know, Mecca and Medina is there. You have the shrines of Sufi holy people on the left, but you have on the right the shrines of Shi holy people around different parts of the Middle East and the wider Muslim world are depicted. So these, I call these the hub posters. So again, the sacred space, Mecca at the center, but then other sacred spaces kind of oriented around them. And the sacred landscape kind of included as part of that depiction for, you know, enhancing piety or visualization within the Muslim community. And then you go to the internet representations, okay? And a lot of that Kaaba-centric perspective among religious organizations and communities still is to the fore. So regardless as to all the changes that Mecca has undergone, pretty much since the 1970s, of which I'll show you some depictions, still this kind of romanticized, idealized image of the sacred space of Mecca in a landscape is conveyed here very clearly. It's a desert landscape, okay? Mecca doesn't look like this at all now, right? But it's kind of an imagined landscape idealizing the locality. This one produced by the Ahl Sunnah organization. And of course, above it are the verses from the Quran that talk about the Kaaba being the first house created for humankind, okay, in Mecca. So it's one of the major verses used, you know, to emphasize the importance of the hajj and going to the house of God in Mecca. And of course, the heavenly light coming from above here. And then the Saudi Ministry of the Hajj has produced a periodical that's available on pretty much online. I don't think I've seen printed copies circulating. There are probably some, but most access to it is from the Hajj Ministry's website. So this periodical, again, continues these kinds of idealized presentations of the Kaaba, okay, in the sacred landscape within which it's situated. And this particular, the verses or the poetry that's above there is talking about this, if you see the water spout here, the mizab, that, you know, directs any rainwater off the Kaaba. It's talking about the blessings that water will provide, you know, to those who it falls on down below. So, so we have this kind of, you know, romanticized, idealized kind of portrayal of the holy sites in Mecca, kind of following it through the photographic, you know, the Ottoman tile representation, the ceramic tile, to the photographs, to the prints, and then online representations of the Kaaba, Mecca, and the surrounding sacred landscape. I'm not going to give you a map of where Mecca is located, you know, assuming in the context of the Middle East Institute, I don't have to do that, but I wanted to give you a sort of geographic orientation to the site of the shrine of Sabarimala, the temple of Sabarimala. So here we're dealing with South India in the state of Kerala, and then the site of Sabarimala is in the Western Ghat Mountains at about an altitude of 4,000 feet. It's located in a tropical rainforest environment, so very different from the arid conditions of Mecca, you know, and Mecca is in a valley. Here we're talking about a holy site, a sacred space at the top of a mountain. So, you know, this is one way in which the shrine is represented with the foregrounding of the image of the idol of the deity Ayyappa. That's the main deity worshipped at Sabarimala, and he's portrayed here in the form in which he's found as an idol inside the Sabarimala temple. It's a yogic posture. So one aspect of the deity Ayyappa is that he is a ascetic god, okay, one of his features. So therefore pilgrimage to his mountaintop shrine involves engaging in what you consider to be largely the Hindu forms of asceticism, you know, avoiding meat, sexual abstinence, avoiding, you know, any kind of violence and things like that, and then dedicating yourself only to the deity. In fact, the pilgrims themselves, once they've been initiated into the pilgrimage and have taken on sacred beads and have started this 41-day period of asceticism that they're supposed to be in for the pilgrimage, become addressed as Ayappa. So they therefore are identified, they're called Ayappas, so they're identified as the deity themselves while they're on the pilgrimage. So there's this interconnectivity between the pilgrims and the deity that's worshipped in the shrine. This gives you, again, two portrayals of Ayappa. This one on the left is another very popular one. It's not the form that he's in at the temple on the mountaintop, but it is the form that he's in at other temples, and another form that by which he's worshipped by his devotees as part of the bhakti tradition in the Hindu religion. And it's as a warrior. Okay, so you have this combination of the male figure, male as an ascetic, the male as a warrior. But again, what I want to point to here also is the issue of the landscape. Here again, a tropical forest kind of landscape that he's in. Obviously, tigers are important as part of that landscape. He's riding one, and that's actually an indication of his divinity, his power to master tigers. And tiger riding is a very important theme in sacred literature, both in the Islamic tradition, particularly Sufism, and then also the Hindu tradition, a sign of divinity or having divine power. The warrior aspect is fighting off the evil forces, demons, barbarians, etc. So that's conveyed there. So it's an interesting kind of integration of the ascetic imagery with the warrior. Now the other image then shows him actually, this is from a poster, religious poster, and this is from a kind of image that people would put up in their homes to worship in their domestic shrine. But over here, what it shows is, Ayappa obviously dominates, but then you have a depiction of his temple here, put in this sort of mountain setting in the Western Ghat mountain, so that landscape is present there. So again, another version of the rendering, of the idealized rendering of the landscapes that these pilgrimages occur in. The pilgrimage to Sabarimala occurs, the main pilgrimage season occurs once a year for a period of 2 months. We're in about the second week of this year's pilgrimage season. It starts in mid-November and continues basically to mid-January, with the most intensive period being in the last week. Totally, the estimates for the number of pilgrims participating during this 1 month or 2 month period is 20 to 30 million pilgrims. Okay, so you have the Hajj involves what? 2.5 to 3 million. That's a mass pilgrimage because you're still dealing with millions. But that occurs in a very restricted time, right? You're just dealing with a matter of a few days with 2.5 to 3 million coming together. Here, because you have a much longer range of time, it's 20 to 30 million by estimates. And the pilgrims are drawn from mostly southern India. So it's a southern Indian pilgrimage site. And drawing most of the pilgrims from both Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Okay? But other pilgrims come from nearby areas, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, some up in Maharashtra and Bombay. And then when you have Keralites or South Indians moving northward into places like Delhi and cities in the north, then you have the establishment of Ayappa temples up there, and of course pilgrims or Hindus from South India that belong to those temples will prepare for the pilgrimage during rituals that are conducted in those temples too. So we have, that being the major catchment area. But as you may know, there are a lot of South Indians that have migrated as part of a transnational labor force. So we have pilgrims coming from the Gulf to the Ayappa temple in Sabarimala, and from Singapore, Malaysia. So you may know there's an Ayappa a shrine in one of the temples here in Torapayo neighborhood, and there's a Hindu temple there, and so there's a shrine for him there. I was just there last week, and there were people that were men preparing to go on the pilgrimage to Sabarimala already. So each year, Singapore sends 100 or several hundred pilgrims to go there. It's a pilgrimage that only men can participate in. Girls can go if they're younger than 10, and older women can go if they're past the age of, or have experienced menopause. But women in the childbearing years are not allowed to go. It has to do with this idea of asceticism, avoiding sexual practice, and the priesthood that runs the temple basically says that women in those age groups can't go. But as you may know, Kerala is a very contentious, political, active state in India. very democratic, and so there are women's organizations lobbying to allow women to go, and even challenging the laws by going themselves on the pilgrimage to Sabarimala. But that's another issue to talk about gender and how that structures itself. So if we look at the Hajj bans non-Muslims right from going to the sacred spaces and things like that. The Sabarimala pilgrimage bans women in these childbearing age, but anybody can go. So they say if Muslim, Christian, Jew, whatever, Buddhist, whatever, no matter what your religion, can go and participate in this pilgrimage. And if, you know, if caste is a concern, because oftentimes castes are not allowed into certain holy sites in the Hindu religion, this is a casteless pilgrimage tradition, so you can be from any social caste from the South Asian context. So give you a little bit more perspective in terms of the nature of this pilgrimage and then who participates in it and where they come from. So other depictions. So we look to the internet kinds of depictions of the Sabarimala pilgrimage or desktop screensavers and things like that, and show you again how the sacred landscapes are rendered here. So, you know, this is sort of the landscape in Kerala itself, in the Western Ghat Mountains areas, and over here you have pilgrims making their way through the tropical forest on the footpath that leads to the mountaintop shrine. That's the traditional way to go. Here they've relocated the deity into Yosemite Valley. So again, sort of imagining sacred landscapes in the natural world, the natural context. So Kerala landscape would be the typical one, but they've sort of then moved it to other places. And this reflects something of the globalization, right, of the pilgrimage tradition to North America. So there are some Ayappa temples or shrines in temples that have made it to North America, and that sort of reflects some of that development. So now let's look at some of the ecological impacts of these mass pilgrimages. So again, 3 million pilgrims in Mecca for the Hajj period, and then we're talking about 20 to 30 million for the 2-month period in Kerala. So obviously we have a major influx of pilgrims pretty much starting in the 1970s as participating in the Hajj. I think before that time we're dealing, you know, largely with pilgrim waves in the tens of thousands, and very much reduced as a result of World War I and World War II. Very low numbers, but then, you know, peaking a little bit around those. What helped initially with modernity and pilgrimage starting in Mecca is the introduction of you know, coal burning ships, and it began to allow large numbers of pilgrims to come from South Asia and Southeast Asia into and participate in the Hajj in Mecca. There were South Asians going there before, but not in large numbers. And so I think the Hajj really you know, changes its dynamics as a result of the onset of new forms of transportation, carrying people from longer distance more quickly in a way in which those people could be transported safely. They didn't have to worry about so much of the pirates at sea or the ship sinking and things like that, although those kinds of things did happen nonetheless. So in 1970s, we began to have a major expansion project occurring in Mecca, you know, moving beyond the Ottoman-based form of the Grand Mosque, et cetera, that was there from previous centuries, that even continued into the time of King Abdulaziz and the founding of the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. When the Saudis got control of the Hijaz and Mecca, and he established, you know, himself as the ruler of the Hijaz, he did initiate some initial changes, and I think they road projects and bringing in electric lights. So there were some small infrastructural changes made with the onset of the Saudi monarchy in the early part of the 20th century, but it really takes off after World War II, particularly then in the 1970s for a building project to be able to accommodate millions of pilgrims. We're not just talking about tens of thousands as in the past. So then we have the 1990s as a result of like a third phase of expansion within the Haram area of Mecca. So basically what you have being done as part of this in terms of ecologies is the displacement of you know, people's living areas and the increasing kind of transformation of the landscape to accommodate automobiles, mass, you know, forms of transportation to carry large numbers of people over the, you know, between the different shrines and holy places that are essential to the performance of the Hajj rituals. And and with this comes the introduction of cooling systems into the Grand Mosque because of the temperatures between 35 and 40 degrees centigrade during the Hajj season. especially obviously during the summer months. This is especially bad. So you have cooling systems, you have air conditioning, you begin to have escalators put into the building. So you have all these forms of modern technology put in this, and all this petroleum-based technology. So here's, in the late 1990s, sort of what the Grand Mosque looked like, estimated as a result of the expansions to be able to hold up to 1 million people at a time, okay, for prayers and things like that. Now, obviously, they all can't be circumambulating the Kaaba at the same time, but for the major prayer times during the Hajj, it's designed to be able to accommodate the most number of people possible. So this gives you an idea of the expansion efforts in Saudi Arabia and the Grand Mosque area. Down here, we're talking about, the first Saudi expansion project. Oops. Let's see if we can bring that back. Here, beginning to increase. The blue line is the pilgrims to Mecca. The others are the number of people going to Medina. And then you have, the different expansion projects then being able to coincide with the accommodating more and more of the pilgrims. This is during the first three, bringing us up to the 1990s here. Okay, so obviously there's another phase that's going on now that's supposed to accommodate even more people, up to 3 million people, I think, is sort of the current ballpark estimate of the number of people that the facilities will be able to contain during the performance of these rituals. These graphs I simply showing to the growth in the number of pilgrims then largely during this period from the 1880s here coming up to the early 2000s as you come up here. So, and this is from outside of Saudi Arabia, okay, international pilgrims coming into the country. And the government of Saudi Arabia keeps very good statistics on these figures. The over here shows the regions from which the pilgrims are coming. So I think this is Africa here. The dark line here is the South Asia and Southeast Asia, and then the kind of dotted line here is pilgrims coming from the Middle East region. So Robert Bianchi has sort of tried to chart, where these different pilgrim groups are coming from, and then I put this together with data about oil revenues, okay, here, and how they have increased during this time period as well to kind of indicate the fact that the expansion projects and the number of pilgrims going is very much tied to a petroleum-based economy and technologies. First of all, it's brought wealth into Saudi Arabia so they can engage in these expansion projects using latest forms of technology, incorporating that within the expansion projects. But it also has brought wealth to Muslim-majority countries that are also involved in oil production or whose citizens are engaged in the oil production industry or downstream industries in one form or another, and have increased income to be able to go. So I look at petroleum-based economies as in addition to piety and identity and fulfilling a religious requirement. Those have always been present, I think. But then if you look at modernity, I think the oil-based economy is particularly critical to understand as a factor for the success of this. Yes, that large numbers began to come with a coal-based one. You remember the ships, ocean transportation, the Indian Ocean transportation, using coal-powered ships and steam power, but now we have petroleum-based. So here you're dealing not only with shipping, you're dealing with automobiles, buses, and of course airplanes. Okay, so of the 3 million or so pilgrims, 2.5 million to 3 million going to Mecca on each Hajj season, about 1 million people are coming in via airplanes. So there's a heavy carbon footprint as a result of that. So urban sprawl comes as a result of that as well. The expansion projects is driving people out of their neighborhoods. Rents and property costs are going up right around the Grand Mosque. Okay, so the Saudi government is obviously reimbursing people to move away outside of where their homes were to new areas of on the outlying parts of the city. Service personnel, et cetera, have to look for cheaper housing in the outlying area, so you have the emergence of sort of slum dwellings, and that's encroaching on the surrounding desert and hill environment in Mecca. So you can see that there. So here, this is fairly recent because you can see that Brag el Beit, this huge structure that's just been completed just a couple of years ago in the Grand Mosque area. So you can see that in the distance. So you can see kind of how the sprawl has spread up into the hillsides here on the outskirts of Mecca. And something else you can also see here is what? Air pollution. Okay, so actually there's been a study done in the last few years at University of California at Irvine in cooperation with the Research Center at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, measuring pollution levels in the Haram area during the Hajj season and finding out that they're very unhealthful for the pilgrims. High levels of obviously carbon monoxide, but other kinds of oil-based pollution as well that affects not only the experience of performing the pilgrimage, but also the health of many of the pilgrims, particularly if they have lung problems, et cetera, but they can also have these impacts on the environment. So here we have pollution, air pollution being a major factor. Again, talking about the airlines and the carbon footprint that they provide coming into the new Jeddah Air Terminal, and automobiles, we just mentioned that. So then we have, how these masses of people are accommodated within the ritual landscape, Mina being a particularly important place that, according to the tradition and the example of Muhammad, pilgrims are supposed to stop in Mecca on the way out to Arafat. You have to be at Arafat for the noon prayer in order to fulfill the requirement of pilgrimage. So obviously this is a major transit point. If you look at, photographs from just a century ago of Mina, you find it just, hardly anybody's there, even during the pilgrimage season. Yes, you can see camps of pilgrims and things like that. But this is like, hillside to hillside stretch of tents that have been set up. And this is the major choke point for the pilgrimage flows of traffic. This is where the stampedes usually occur, right in this area. It's a very narrow valley, and you have large numbers of people trying to get to the same place at the same time. So it's a major place for stampedes, so there's that impact there. That obviously the Saudi Hajj ministry, in coordination with other ministries in the Saudi government and architectural firms, are trying to find ways to design this more efficiently to prevent those accidents, but nonetheless there have been a recurrence of Hajj deaths as a result of the crowding that occurs in these areas. So a priority for the Saudi government is obviously the safety and security of the guests of God, the pilgrims. And so any environmental concerns or preservation of the traditional environment in some way are minimized in order to be able to find ways to create safe facilities for the pilgrims so that they can fulfill their ritual duties. And of course, even though there are many pilgrims in air-conditioned tents, other people, don't want to have a travel agent and pay the extra expense, so they kind of go on their own on the Hajj. So you have then people trying to improvise accommodations while they're there. But with that many pilgrims there, obviously trash removal is a big issue. So environmental pollution as a result of human refuse is a major concern. It has a major impact on the environment, and particularly plastics. One study I've seen estimated that there's something like 10 million bottles of plastic that are left behind after each Hajj year. So you can imagine, the ecological impacts of that. And again, a petroleum-based pollutant, shall we say, when you're dealing with plastic and that amount of plastic. And of course, there's no, as far as I'm able to find, there's no government instructions for people to carry out what they take in or to throw away the plastic in a disposal bin, or there's no green recycling boxes that I've seen mention of in the Saudi Hajj ministry literature and other kinds of sources. So we're dealing with these kinds of pollution just getting more and more serious as they try to accommodate these numbers of pilgrims. Water is a key issue. So obviously one of the first issues that Muslims and Muslim rulers had to take care of was the water supply for the pilgrims. Here you see a 1941 photograph of a flood in the mosque area. So there's actually someone swimming in the mosque. So there had to be, if you were a ruler, whether you're based in Medina or Baghdad in the medieval period or Riyadh in the modern period, contending with these floods, periodic floods, was one thing they had to worry about, right, on an occasional basis, and finding efficient ways to divert the water and find ways of perhaps exploiting it for times when there isn't rain, which is most of the year, and also providing water to the pilgrims. It's one of the earliest forms of charitable investment by rulers, was to provide water to the pilgrims along the pilgrimage routes and in the sacred areas of Mecca. So that goes back to the Caliphal period. We have those kinds of infrastructural projects, water supply, and then regulating floods that might affect the sacred mosque area. Another key area within the sacred mosque is the Zemzem well. And although it's not a ritual requirement, pilgrims, for the most part, want to have access to the sacred water that comes from the well that was traditionally next to the Kaaba, and take it home with them, or at least drink it. It's believed to have blessing power, barakah, but also healing properties that are attributed to it by even the Prophet Muhammad, according to the Hadith. So we have then how that is contended with. So there's actually a Zemzem research center in Mecca that monitors the water supply there and its availability and the content of the water. So theoretically, it's from alluvial, waters that have, gone into underground. And so this is a well, it's tapping underground water that comes from those rainfalls. But there's a question of the supply. What happens if you're short of rainwater, or because of so many people now living in Mecca, you have 2 million people, that the flow of water into the ground, resources, I forgot the term now, the aquifer is reduced. So there's a problem of the access to the sacred water of the Zemzem well. But so they've closed off the well because of the expansion projects. It used to be people could just go up to it and someone would lower a bucket down into the water and bring it up, and you'd have your flask or something and take it home or away with you or drink it. Now they have a redistribution system, so they provide they provide these Zemzem water canisters in the vicinity of the Grand Mosque and even beyond it at different stations, so you don't have to be all clustered around the same area to have access to the water. But then with that kind of resource, again, and that many people, you still have to have some kind of device or some kind of monitoring of the water supply and the quality and content of the water. So here you have a water testing expert here trying to monitor the levels of minerals and bacteria in particular that might be present in the containers. And again, water dealing with cooling systems provided to the pilgrims because of the high temperatures and the fact that many pilgrims suffer heat prostration and the impacts of the crowding and things. So we have the provision of these sprays of water. This is particularly in the area of Arafat, where it can get so intense, so hot and so crowded. This is not Zemzem water that's being used, okay? So Saudi Arabia, about 50% of its water comes from desalinized water installations and desalinization plants. Then they're using sort of fossil waters too, but again, that supply is depleting. And then they're engaging in more and more recycling of water supply. But when you're talking about the 50% production of desalinized water, you're talking about again, power that comes from burning of petroleum-based fuels. There is a solar-powered renewable energy desalination plant in the planning stages in Saudi Arabia. They say, of course, it's going to be the largest in the world and things like that. But it hasn't been implemented yet, so you're still dealing with the impacts of even trying to provide water to the pilgrims, having a carbon footprint as a result of the use of carbon-based fuels to produce the desalinated water. Again, this is continuing the process of expansion. So, in terms of the environment, the natural environment, you have the leveling of hills and mountains, and then increasing the built environment of that structure, which again have negative impacts on the overall ecology of the area of Mecca. So this is one of the latest expansion projects in the sort of in the mid-2000s. I want to just point it out, see what happened to the Kaaba there. So the expansion projects architecturally, physically are dwarfing the sacred center, from the level of perspective. And I don't think that's even an issue. I think that's not just a matter of the way we're seeing it here, but if you're a pilgrim inside of the Grand Mosque, you're obviously moved and thrilled to be there. Almost all pilgrims have something to say about the transforming experience of being in the Grand Mosque and seeing the Kaaba for the first time and being brought to tears. But then right behind it is this huge, structure behind it, the Abraj al-Bayt. So you're talking about visual pollution as well, unless you really love sort of Soviet-style monumental architecture transported to the Middle East, which is what the Abraj al-Bayt largely is in terms of design. Okay, and that's a more complete stage of that expansion project. So again, you can see the creation of high-rises. So whereas traditional housing and public facilities in the area would have been designed with the indigenous environment taken into consideration for the circulation of air and sort of cool things down that way. Here you have then more and more need for air conditioning for these high-rise structures. Again, the property value has gone up so high, you have to go up to accommodate people, and not so much out. Now to another world completely, a photograph from the 1940s or 50s of pilgrims making their way to the mountaintop shrine of Sabarimala, so giving you the idea, representation of the environment there through photography. And this is just taken last year, the carrying of the jewels of the god Ayappa from the royal house of Pandalam, which is located near the coast, to the mountaintop shrine during the high point of the pilgrimage season in mid-January. So, you have these still traditional forms of movement through the tropical forest environment present being observed today. Here's a photograph from that from the 1940s, 50s of the Ayappa temple at that time. So very small kind of place, and obviously there weren't 20 to 30 million people going there at that time. We were just dealing with a very localized pilgrimage tradition. There probably isn't much of a pre-modern history to this site, except as a maybe local forest deity shrine, and not this trans-regional pilgrimage shrine that's drawing people from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. And so this is what it looks like today, with the crowd, during the major pilgrimage season around it. The major purpose for going to the temple, obviously, in part, is to have a vision, a darshan of the deity inside of the temple in the Holy of Holies, the Sri Kovil. But there's also the idea of bringing prasad or bringing, an offering to the deity, and to get prasad back, this sort of leavings of the deity that you can take home with you. Again, a way of carrying away the blessings from the god once you've been to Ayappa. So that kind of exchange of food substances as well as visual substances is an important part of the Sabarimala pilgrimage. So whereas in Mecca, the choke point is right there in the valley of Medina between Mecca and Arafat. Here, the major choke point occurs right, getting to the temple itself, and so that's where there is a major impact in terms of crowding and having to accommodate all those pilgrims there. So here, a depiction of how they've sort of naturalized, indigenized, shall we say, motorized transportation on the Sabarimala pilgrimage. So ideally, you go on foot. That's a traditional way of going on the journey, sort of minimizing your carbon footprint, right, by walking. And there's still many pilgrims that walk, a lot, if not all the distance, a large part of it. But more and more are taking motorized transportation. So here's an effort to sort of, indigenize or naturalize the petroleum-based vehicle of pilgrims. And then obviously then you have more, typically, is this scene of the bus parking area located at the base of the mountain. So this is where people come. If they're taking motorized transportation, this is where they come. They're dropped off, and then they take a hike of several kilometers to the top of the mountain to see the temple. So again, you can see the impact that, again, petroleum-based energy has made in terms of this tropical forest kind of environment. Visual pollution. Okay, this happens to be a billboard, but notice the electrical wires going all through. This is a town about 45 miles away from the mountaintop shrine. It's located in an agricultural flatland, sort of in a valley near the mountains. It's called Erumeli. This contains a shrine of a Muslim saint who is believed to have been a buddy of Ayappa, the Hindu deity, and together they fought battles together and things like that. So for pilgrims going to Sabarimala, most of whom are Hindu, if you're going for the first time, the ideal is to go multiple times, at least 18 times. But at the first time, you have to stop at Erumeli and do a puja or worship at the shrine of the Muslim saint as part of that. So it occurs right down, this picture is taken right down the street from that Muslim saint shrine. It's actually advertising sandals to wear if you're a pilgrim. So right at the base of the mountain, near that that bus parking area, there's a sacred river called the Campo River. And so again, you have millions of people passing through here on their way to the mountaintop shrine. They use the river for cleansing, obviously ritual cleansing and ablutions, which is a typical Hindu practice, right? If you've seen pictures of Hindus in Varanasi bathing, in the holy waters of the Ganges, basically the Pampa River is considered to be the Ganges, the same water. And so there's kind of this ritualized bathing that's required, but also people use it for bodily cleanings, not just for bathing. So you have the pollution of the river with, what comes from that, as well as soaps and things like that. People throwing clothes into the river, as well as defecating. So you have, very unhealthful kinds of pollution occurring in this river that flows right at the base of the mountain, considered to be a sacred river. The same issue is happening with the Ganges River up north. That is so sacred, it's considered a deity by the Hindus, but then the pollution that goes into it is unbelievable. So there's kind of this cognitive dissonance between pollution and sacredness combined in the same very locality. And this is something of the aftermath, at the end of the pilgrimage season of what that river looks like. And the other issue that's occurring because of probably climate change is the amount of rainfall coming into Kerala in the monsoon season has declined, so you have less water available, so they're having to find ways to store water in a way that they never had to before. So that's an issue, so you have more pilgrims coming through. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, with the Hajj, the Saudi government has found it very helpful to set limits on the number of pilgrims who can go there, right? So there's this kind of Hajj quota system that's been established as of 1988 or so. It's been a convenient way by which Saudis are able to limit the flow in. But for Sabarimala, there's no limit. There's no agency that's saying only so many people can go. So basically you have escalating numbers of pilgrims going every year. And so that, again, more of an impact. Garbage, okay, particularly plastic is a major issue here too, in terms of pollution. And then burning of garbage. So here's this beautiful tropical forest, and then you're having this polluted smoke infiltrating the area. But this is a nighttime photo, so you're dealing with 24/7 of human impact with crowds, large crowds, camping out or moving through the sacred territory. You have the noise, loudspeakers making announcements all the time if somebody gets lost. If not religious chanting going on, it's going to be looking for so-and-so and meet them somewhere else using big loudspeakers. That's so you have the noise pollution. And then you have the visual pollution as well, light pollution. Remember, we're dealing here with a tropical forest environment. It's actually considered to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This area, the surrounding area of the Sabarimala temple, not because the temple is located there, but because of the tropical forest, that there are hundreds of thousands of species of birds and insects that aren't present in other environments. And there's a tiger preserve there too. So you know how rare tigers are. So these ecological impacts, from the pilgrimage are affecting diversely in a negative way that sacred mountain environment. So that leads us into the last part of the talk, which has to do with the ways in which people are trying to deal with these impacts on the environment within which those pilgrimages occurred. So in Saudi Arabia, you have the efforts to launch forms of mass transportation, such as this high-speed train that will link together Medina and Mecca, and people, will be encouraged to take this. As I see right now, the ticket costs about $30 to take it, so probably not every pilgrim can afford to do that. But the people who are interested in sort of a green pilgrimage to Mecca will advocate taking public transportation or mass transportation, not going in individual cars and buses so much. And then there's also been a metro system installed in Mecca itself, linking the downtown area of Mecca with the outer areas for the ritual performances in Mina and Arafat. So again, that's being looked at as a way to deal with the crowding, but also a form of adaptation to the ecological impacts to reduce the carbon imprint on the area around there, pollution, et cetera. So we have that new metro system put in. We have sanitation was a major issue for pilgrims, as the 1970s and 80s, as more and more pilgrims were going to Mecca. So the available toilet facilities and things like that became increasingly crucial. You can read Hajj accounts from that 1970s period or 1960s period that talk about the poor sanitation in the holy city. And so we have obviously efforts to accommodate this and installing more facilities for the treatment of human waste, and you actually have major wastewater treatment facilities now being opened up to accommodate the flow of waste that comes from the numbers of people that go there on pilgrimage each year. So again, these are all kind of top-down initiatives being taken by the Saudi government to deal with the human impacts of mass pilgrimage that have environmental as well as other kinds of consequences. And then we have the, you could kind of say this is a traditional way of depicting the destruction of the cultural environment in Saudi Arabia too as a result of trying to accommodate the numbers of pilgrims that are there. So you have the destruction of the heritage architecture that already had started back, you could say when the Wahhabis took control of Mecca and Medina. They destroyed a lot of the shrines and the cemeteries that were present there as part of the cultural presence from pre-modern times. But with the expansion projects, then you have the destruction of traditional architectural installations. This happens to be the Ottoman arcades in the Grand Mosque area itself, which the Turkish government protested, and there are also a number of Saudi cultural preservationists and traditional people interested in preserving the cultural heritage protesting these kinds of steps. But the Saudi government gave precedence to the fact that they want to see the safety and security and accommodation of the pilgrims first, rather than preserving cultural heritage. So as a result of the protests, though, I've read that they've agreed to set up some of these arcades out in Arafat somewhere, so completely out of context. So you had kind of a museum presentation of the Ottoman arcades, but again, it's going to be in a way that's not really incorporated within the Hajj process. Is more kind of a memory if anybody wants to go there, kind of thing. By the way, the Bin Laden Corporation is the one that's been primarily involved with the renovation projects, okay? And we have accounts of the life of Osama bin Laden where he drove one of those bulldozers or steam shovels and was involved in some of the 1970s renovations in the Haram area. So here's a depiction of what the latest expansion phase is supposed to look like. With again, you have the towers over here currently, but then many more high rises around it, and then a much greatly increased mosque area to accommodate as many as 3 million pilgrims. And of course, all of that signed, sealed, and delivered by the royal family. This is what I meant by the kind of top-down kind of structuring of the Hajj environment, particularly since the 1970s, and this close association of the Saudi royal family with this process. As you know, the Saudi kings prefer the title of the Khadim al-Harimain al-Sharifain, the servant of the two sacred mosques, rather than king. And so this comes from the magazine Al-Hajj wal-Umrah, okay, put out by the Hajj Ministry, showing King Abdullah, and obviously dominating, larger than the Kaaba, okay, and almost as big as the towers, the Hajj Tower, the Abraj al-Bayt shopping hotel complex that's been installed outside of the Kaaba. So just again, it's the idea that the kind of Saudi authoritarian way of accommodating the pilgrims. Now in Sabarimala, I know you're sort of close to the end of my first hour. Sorry, it's taking a little bit longer than I thought, but here I wanted to show you what's being done in Sabarimala. Notice the signs in Malayalam and English. Say no to plastic, join us to make Sabarimala plastic free. And so this kind of campaign is being waged by the Travancore Devaswam Board, which is the agency that oversees temple administration in India. It's supervised by the government, in Kerala. It's supervised by the government, but it's composed by non-government people in particular. And but it's also other agencies are involved in this. I should point out that unlike Saudi Arabia very much, you don't have a monarchy in Kerala. You have a democratically elected government based on political parties and regular elections, which involve a lot of the population in Kerala. So the government traditionally, in modern times, since it was created in 1954, and currently is a communist party government. So it's a communist dictatorship, communist democracy type government, non-religious, okay, but being responsible for working in the management of the sacred sites in Kerala. And for touristic purposes, I'm sure they see a benefit of that, because Kerala is talked about as being God's country and a place where you can go for Ayurvedic medical treatment and things like that, and obviously tour the backwaters and things for in the environment sites. So that's important for the government to bring in tourist revenue, but nonetheless, it's obliged to engage in working with temple administration boards to try to redress the issues raised by the pollution of the area where Sabarimala is located. So in conjunction with this green campaign, going back to at least 2005, you have a contract set up with this financial services and ecological contractor here, with the Travancore Devastation Board, the Kerala State, particularly the Ministry of Environment and Forest. There's a Ministry of Environment and Forest that's very much part of this, as well as stakeholders from the national government. So on the site for this company, the consultancy, to come up with a master plan for Sabarimala to deal with the pollution and the impacts on the environment. It says there, the project, which is supposed to be from 2005 to 2050, looking down the line, is to ensure the development of Sabarimala into a world-class pilgrim center. Okay, so that's kind of a touristic language there, but then it includes the temple complex and the surrounding forest reserve. Periyar Forest Reserve is the name of that particular one, which will be approached in a complementary and eco-friendly manner so as to provide a satisfying pilgrimage experience to the pilgrims visiting the holy shrine. So that eco-friendliness is built into the ways in which they're dealing with the pollution and the environmental impacts of this mass pilgrimage. Okay, so as I indicated before, Saudi Arabia seems to be mainly concerned with the safety and security of the pilgrims, but you don't see kind of promotion of the eco-friendliness of that, although they may be moved to move in that direction more and more. And the overall objective, according to this plan, is to provide a basic infrastructure and facilities for pilgrims while safeguarding the environment. So again, it's kind of built into this Sabarimala master plan. So here you have the installation of green waste containers in the area of the sacred temple up in Sabarimala. It's part of this green campaign. Waste collection, okay, being done. So having people hired to engage in waste collection and featuring that in the media so that people see that as something you're supposed to do, pick up your trash. Also to promoting the idea of if you take in plastic, well, first of all, don't take in plastic, but if you do have plastic, don't just throw it away out in the forest or along the trail. Find a place to dispose it in one of these recycling bins. So you have, sort of a depiction of that here. And they've even brought in the rapid action force of the national government. Usually they're there to monitor the crowds and direct pilgrims and sort of keep everything in an orderly way, prevent things from getting too chaotic. So they're basically there for security purposes, crowd control and things. But they've now been recruited into, at least for this photo op opportunity, to show them involved in the clean, green Sabarimala pilgrimage campaign. You have here a depiction of the officials connected with not only the Devaswan board, but also the Kerala government, dedicating a sewage treatment plant. This was just last year that opened up. This is after years of people lobbying to have a sewage treatment plant provided to accommodate, again, the outflow coming from all these people coming to Sabarimala. As I said, people before were using the river, using the forest as their toilets. And you can imagine, as millions of people come through, that has, very bad healthful and larger environmental costs. So we have then, this dedication ceremony. I was just reading today a news release in The Hindu, which is basically a South Indian newspaper, that said that the people operating the sewage treatment plant are shutting it down because they're not getting paid for the project. So you have millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, coming into the temple as a result of these pilgrims. But there's a lot of corruption. The Kerala government has pointed out, and the media in Kerala have pointed this out. There's corruption in the temple governing board. And so obviously the resources aren't going to paying the bills. And so those inefficiencies and corruption and things like that are affecting the success of the plant. So you can imagine now all of a sudden, this whole region during one of the high points of the pilgrimage season is now being faced with not having adequate sewage treatment facilities. This is a picture of the Periyar tropical forest area. That's park. This part of this UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Western Ghat Mountains. This is where Sabarimala is located, in the middle of this park. And then you have NGOs involved in trying to protect the tigers from the impacts of the mass pilgrimages coming through. Okay, before I don't think it was so much an issue, but with the changes that have occurred pretty much in the last 20 years, when you have such large numbers of pilgrims going, you have NGOs and environmental agencies in Kerala, because it's a very politically active citizenry there, unlike other parts of India even, and all very literate, very educated, multilingual, and activist, in terms of ecological issues. So they're very careful, for the most part, not to condemn the pilgrimage and criticize the pilgrims and things like that, but to try to engage in a kind of ways of communicating a more ecological consciousness to the wider population and protecting areas that are particularly sensitive. So now there's been launched recently, there's a British-based organization called the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, which has created a green pilgrimage network. And coming out of that initiative is a green guide to the Hajj, produced in 2011, which advises, it's written by UK Muslims primarily in English, but it's got the imprimatur of the Sheikh of Al-Azhar University, Ali Guma, saying that, try to perform a green Hajj. So that means, minimizing the amount of plastic you buy. Don't throw trash, anywhere when you're there, and, make sure you try to recycle as much as possible. Try to select travel agencies that support eco-travel, and if they don't, find ways to encourage them to do that. So, and they said, if you take an airplane to get to Mecca, well, give some money to a local environmental group, okay, to make up for the, the impact on the carbon, the carbon level, the carbon impact on the environment, sort of compensate for it in some way. Again, it's urging, care while you're in the pilgrimage areas in the Hajj, take these forms of public transportation, and then when you get back from the Hajj, try to maintain a kind of eco-consciousness, as one who's been to the pilgrimage in Mecca. And again, this kind of getting a theological inspiration based on the idea of human beings being charged with being the agents of God, the Khalifa, in charge of God's creation, and having a moral and ethical responsibility to care for it, kind of this concept of stewardship that's conveyed in the Quran. So you have the verses from the Quran that refer to this idea of stewardship quoted in the Green Hajj Manual, so there's Quranic justification being given there. So, but notice this is coming from an NGO. This is not coming from the government of Saudi Arabia, this kind of discourse. You don't have signs up in the Hajj area that I've been able to see in all the photography that's been done there of, calling people to become eco-conscious, don't throw your trash, pick up, things that you leave, would otherwise throw away, things like that, recycle things. So let's see, what else did I want? So in Saudi Arabia, basically the concern is, provide resources for the pilgrims and their safety and security and health, okay? But not so much this broader sort of ecological component. There is a Saudi Commission for Wildlife Conservation and Development, but as far as I've seen, based on the information that I've had on the web, there's no direction of that to talk about the impacts of the Hajj on wildlife in that part, in the Hijaz area of Saudi Arabia. There's also a Meteorological and Environmental Protection Administration, but that's more concerned with the health of the pilgrims too, the health impacts of the pilgrimage and the climate on the pilgrims, not so much in terms of broader environmental concerns. With Sabarimala, you have a government involved, as I said, through the Ministry particularly of Environment and Forests, and you have various pollution control agencies directly involved in the Sabarimala pilgrimage. You also have, at a higher level in India, the Indian Ministry for Environment, Forest, and Climate Change. Okay, so very critical to have government bodies that oversee this. But then the NGO component is very important too. So I mentioned the Green Campaign, and coming out of that is this Punyam, Punakavanam NGO. It's named after the Divine Grove, a way of referring to the forest around the temple there in Sabarimala, established in 2011. And then you have one of the agencies in Kerala responsible for environmental protection, like the Tiger Preserve is called the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. And this engaged in a number of projects throughout India. And one of their projects is right there with the Tiger Preserve in the Periyar forest. So again, more kind of NGO involvement. The acronym for Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment is A-TREE. So again, give you an idea of the ecological sort of component of that. And they even come up with a mascot for their campaign. His name is Parya Swami, so he's kind of named after the forest. And he's depicted not only as an Ayyappa pilgrim, but particularly as the senior pilgrim who's been to Sabarimala many times and serves as the person who initiates new pilgrims into the Hajj. So here he's kind of looked at as kind of a wisdom figure who has good advice for the devotees of Ayyappa, and sort of he becomes the mascot for this Punayam Punakavanam NGO. And then of course they're also incorporating Ayyappa himself, come up with a theme song, and initiative for responsible and conscious pilgrimage. So we have the warrior Ayyappa sort of being used there to help promote their concerns and their interests to sort of dealing with the environmental impacts of these massive numbers of pilgrimages going through the sacred territory. So by way of conclusion, I had a kind of formal kind of conclusion I wanted to give, but basically what I wanted to do is show you the impacts, number one, but the different ways in which the impacts are being addressed. And I'm not going to reduce those explanations for the difference to religion. So you can't say, well, the Hindus are more respectful of the environment, so therefore they're more sensitive to the green, and Muslims are not respectful of the environment, so they don't care what happens to the environment. It can't be reduced that way. What I think is really determinative here is the nature of the political systems that oversee those mass pilgrimages and the institutions that deal with them. A very authoritarian one in the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, where there's very little opportunity for people with alternative visions and ways of dealing with the ecological impacts to express themselves and come up with different ideas. Whereas in Kerala, you have this very pluralistic democratic society where things are argued over and governments can change quickly, and there's more opportunity for NGOs and public advocacy to occur within that context. So I think we're largely looking at the different ways in which we have the pilgrimage sacred territories administered by political agencies in the area. It's not something that can be reduced to the difference between religions, because I indicated already the most sacred areas for Hindu religious geography are very much polluted. Ganges River, the Sabarimala area, et cetera. So we can't reduce environmental consciousness to religious identity. I think political explanation, and then the impacts of the petroleum-based energy in all kinds of ways as being a major factor too. So those are, thank you for bearing with me. I've gone a little bit over time, I think. But